Children need unconditional positive regard. They need to know that their worth is not contingent on good behavior. Behavior might be important in terms of being pro-social and considerate of other people, but that doesn't make them more or less lovable. But if they learn that their lovability does rest on how they behave, that's going to create a traumatic wound inside the self, because now I don't value who I am. I have to constantly perform and be a perfectionist or be a people pleaser or whatever it is.
Composer, lyricist, co-author of The Myth of Normal, mental chiropractor, and ghostwriter for the Wu-Tang Clan. Just joking. Daniel Maté, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much. Nice to meet you. Nice to be here with you, Boo Boo.
Thank you. Had to throw that in. I thought that would sound pretty cool.
Oh, dude, that's the best introduction I've ever gotten. I wish. They don't need me.
You're welcome.
Yeah.
I appreciate you coming on because, I'm just starting off and you said yes immediately. And that meant a lot to me because I was getting turned down a lot. So I appreciate that. Thank you again.
Well, I appreciate the opportunity to come on and talk about some important stuff and find out where you're coming from and have a conversation I've never had before.
Yeah, thank you. The Myth of Normal. Maybe I would let you walk us into that. There's a lot of listeners that may not have read your book. I think it's a must read for anyone. It's touched me in so many different ways and helped broaden my lens in many aspects of the human condition. Even with the 12-step recovery, I got sober in 2009 and challenging some stuff, and it really helped me a lot because we talked a little bit about my path, and it's very helpful. So very insightful and giving a new view, a new outlook on things was very refreshing.
I'm glad to hear it.
Thank you.
Yeah, I'm glad to hear it. You're welcome. So to talk about the book, so just for those who don't know, it came out on the day we're recording this, we're 1 week away from the 1 year anniversary of the book. And it's been a bestseller in several countries, Canada, United States. It's been translated into, I think, 30 languages or something like that. So it's pretty exciting. It's not strictly my book. The primary author on it is my father, Gabor Maté. And I came aboard to help him make the thing happen and make it taste better and be less filling. The Bud Light principle. Or was that Miller Lite? I forget. Anyway, it's a big topic. The subtitle of the book is Trauma, Illness, and Healing in a Toxic Culture. Well, that's a mouthful, So, the book is, you talked about the human condition. Those are the words that stuck out to me in your introduction. And it's interesting because when people say the human condition, we usually mean kind of just what it naturally is to be human. Like you're born into being a human being and here's the condition we're in, But in a way, we're talking more about, there's the human condition in terms of what we're born with and sort of what human beings need, what we're born to expect, what we're born to require for our optimal development. But then there's human conditioning, which is something else entirely, which is the stuff that happens to us, And so the kind of condition we're talking about is the original condition. And the conditions, you could take this word and flip it many different ways. The conditions that would be necessary for a healthy human being and a healthy community or world full of human beings to grow up. But to look at that is to compare that vision with the world we actually have and the conditions we actually have. So we're talking about the human condition inside of some pretty abnormal, unnatural conditions. So if that isn't enough of a brain twister, the title, The Myth of Normal, is saying that many things we take to be just normal parts of the human condition are in fact only normal inside of a highly abnormal situation that we're living in now. And historically, that's also just true, because I don't remember exactly how long human beings have been on the scene. But if you were to represent that span of many hundreds of thousands of years or tens of thousands of years, I don't know, on the minutes on a clock, an hour on a clock, we've only been living in what we call so-called civilized society for the last 6 minutes. Before that, it was hunter-gatherer groups, small band groups of people who relied on each other, who had to cooperate. Yeah, there was competition for resources between groups. And yes, there was violence. We're not trying to idealize anything or say we need to get back to the past or anything. But these were the societies that evolved from the essential human condition. You know, wild horses, if you look at how wild horses live, that's what wild horses have become given the conditions they live in. And we can see what a wild horse in an optimal environment would look like. Well, for a long time, human beings had an arrangement with each other of collaboration, cooperation, community, something other than the individualistic me, self-oriented, it's all my fault, it's all to my credit, you know, be all you can be and fuck everyone else. You know, is it okay to curse on this show?
Sure.
Okay. Because it might happen. You know, Method Man hasn't cursed in his raps for the last 20 years. He's really proud of that.
Wow. No, I never noticed.
Yeah.
That's awesome.
Speaking of Wu-Tang. Yeah. So, you know, and what do we learn in school when we learn about economics? We learn about Homo economicus, the economic human, the economic man, right? That this is the basics of who we are. Selfishness, acquisitiveness, personal self-interest, as defined as different than communal self-interest. But that's totally abnormal. That's an aberration from how, and it's also completely evolutionarily unintelligent. If you think about the kinds of conditions we evolved in. In fact, in many indigenous societies, the idea of individual self-interest doesn't even exist. There's a word, I think Wetiko is the name, in several North American First Nations or indigenous tribes or languages, which literally means a kind of demon spirit that possesses a person into believing that they alone control their own destiny, and they are, you know, that their life is about acquiring and doing for self in the very narrow sense of the word self. They understood that there is no self separate from the group. It's actually an illusion. It's an optical illusion. Now, it's an understandable optical illusion because, look, you and I are separate. We have separate bodies. We live in separate places. We have separate biographies. We have different cultural backgrounds. You know, from the little I know about you, there's a lot of things you've been through that I, on the surface, shouldn't be able to relate to, right? So we live in a world that accentuates this myth and says that it's normal for us to think of ourselves as not connected. But even biologically, it's not true. Never mind evolutionarily. Our biology is interconnected with each other. And if you listen to pop music, you know that's true. You know, I get weak in the knees. I can hardly speak. You know, we quote Bruce Springsteen in the book. You know, I wake up in the night with the sheets soaking wet. There's a freight train running through the middle of my head. What's he talking about? He's talking about a relationship with a woman. You know, what all shook up. You know, you shake my nerves and you rattle my brain. We do this to each other. We actually do. And our biology is affected by the world around us, which makes sense. If you want to grow an oak tree, it's not enough to have an acorn. You got to have the soil. You got to have the sun. You got to have the irrigation. It takes certain conditions. So the book is about the human condition. It's about human conditioning, and it's about the inhuman conditions that we're currently living in. So I'd actually never thought of it that way. So I appreciate you phrasing it that way, because that's a nice way to kind of flip that phrase, because we are looking at it from all those different angles. And ultimately, the reason we're looking at it is because, I mean, look, if everything was going peachy, if humans were getting healthier and happier, why would there be no need to write a book like this? But the first line in the book is, in the most health obsessed society in human history, all is not well. You look at the rates of chronic illness are going up. The disparity in the illnesses between men and women is ridiculously changing. A century ago, multiple sclerosis was equal proportions in men and women. Now women are 6 times more likely to have it, or something like that. Maybe it's 4 times. Well, that's not genetic, you know. Same thing with asthma and African Americans. Their African genetic relatives don't have it at near the same rates, you know. Indigenous alcoholism and drug abuse. There was no addiction or alcoholism, or very, very rarely. It wasn't an epidemic at all before white people got to this continent, you know. So there's something's changed in our conditions and our conditioning that's leading to really dire health outcomes. And the more we assume, oh, the world is normal, but these people have abnormal things, we're missing the boat. These are actually normal adaptations and responses to highly unnatural conditions. And that's the basic gist of the book. And it ends with a big section on healing, because we would be doing people a disservice, I think, if we just kind of diagnosed everything that's fucked up and didn't have anything to say about how we can start to orient ourselves towards something more whole.
That's one thing that really helped me out in the book, is looking at the environment. I was always taught, look at the genes, or you have a disease, called alcoholism. And I love the fact that you and your father challenged the disease model as well, or bring it up, because even the co-founder of Alcoholics Anonymous, Bill Wilson, had a problem with that as well, with the disease part. But it made a lot of sense to me, because I got to look at what happened to me, and look at my environment, and not as being a victim or speaking victimese. Or it's important to know I may have been a victim to certain circumstances or whatever, in one way. But if I get stuck in victimhood and use that as part of my identity, then it just made me sick. I can't speak for anyone else, but that's my experience. And when I realized that, whoa, like, okay, I just didn't know how to process things. I didn't know how to talk about things. I didn't know how to, I didn't know how to communicate with my mother or my father. This is how I'm feeling. That masculinity part, in the culture, et cetera, et cetera. I just know how to process things and have the proper coping skills to heal or deal with things properly. So it got stuffed down in me.
Right. And the reason it's important to know that is it's actually practical. Compassion for yourself is practical. It's not airy-fairy. It's not new age. Until you can see what happened, you can't deal with what's going on now. And you're right. You're absolutely right. It's brilliant. It's not about being a victim. I mean, in some sense, we're all victim. Like, we didn't ask to be born. We certainly didn't ask to be born where and when we were born. My dad was literally a victim of fate when it comes to being born in the middle of the Holocaust, a Jewish baby in Hungary in 1944. But we're all, I mean, the Greeks wrote about fate. I mean, that is part of the human condition, right? But fate doesn't have to mean destiny. Fate's what we start with, and destiny is where we're heading. But you have to, I think actually it's quite the opposite of being a victim. You can't fully be responsible until you know what you're responding to. You have to see the facts clearly. And the facts are, I had the childhood I had, and it had this effect on me. Now that I know that, I can ask myself, well, what am I committed to? What am I willing to give up? What am I, because I'm now I can be responsible for it. Now I'm stuck in these ruts as a result. And now that I know, if I don't work to change it, then I'm choosing to actually be the victim of my circumstances, as opposed to become the person that I was really born to be. So it's very important to take a look at the past. As far as the disease model, yeah, that's one of two misconceptions about addiction that we take on. The other one, of course, is the bad choices model, which is worse than useless. That's the kind of conservative, typically Republican kind of, but lots of people kind of subtly see it that way. that, people, drug addicts make bad choices. They don't have self-control, all kinds of stuff. Well, they don't have self-control because their brains didn't develop right. Self-control is actually a mental skill, It's there are parts of the brain that are responsible for inhibition and discernment and things like that. And also people who use drugs to self-medicate, or alcohol or behavior, sex, shopping, anything, gambling, they're trying to soothe pain. These are all painkillers. And why do they have so much pain? That's the question. Now, the disease model is interesting because clearly there's some value to it. It's helped a lot of people. And I think my theory is it gives people a name for something, and it's almost a story you can tell yourself that's a helpful story. It's a metaphor, I think. It's best understood because there's no evidence that alcoholism or anything is a brain disease. It shows signs of it because, of course, alcohol affects the brain. And there are differences in the brains of addicts, drug addicts in particular, and even before they get into drugs. But that doesn't say anything about it being a disease. That's the result of, that's a developmental disorder, you could say. Or if you want to take it even a step further, that's an understandable developmental result of the childhood some people have. That certain centers, self-soothing, the opioid, the internal endorphins, which is the body's natural opioids, the kind of farm-to-table, homegrown organic heroin that we're supposed to be able to provide. That's painkillers. Dopamine, that's what cocaine replaces. Excitement, motivation, reward, all that kind of stuff. So it can look like a disease, but a disease, if that word is going to mean anything, it's like a virus, or it's a kind of external. I mean, we even challenge the notion of the word disease in the book, but I won't get into that right now. but I can understand. I mean, when someone says my disease is trying to kill me, which I know people say in 12-step, I'm not in recovery myself, but I've, really all I know about recovery is from watching Breaking Bad on The Wire, but it's in the culture. And I've heard people say my disease wants to kill me. Well, when they say my disease wants to kill me, one of the good things about saying that is that they're separating themselves from, they're getting some distance from the thing itself. So I am not my alcoholism. My alcoholism is this thing, and I have it, and I can be in relationship with it. And that's really good. So metaphors are useful, but it's poetic. It's not actually literal. And if you think it's literal, then you're going to fall into actually identifying with it. I am an alcoholic, as opposed to I am someone who, because of the life I've lived, and maybe some choices I've made, you can include choice in it if you want, have developed an unhealthy and unsustainable relationship with the substance called alcohol. And now I'm choosing to renegotiate that relationship, and I can't have it in my life. Well, that's a way of saying the exact same thing, but it's a little less doom and gloom, but it's not a slogan, and it's harder to, it's a bit more subtle. And I can see why people, I shouldn't call it a slogan, but it's not as catchy. And it takes a little bit more nuance, So I think you can obviously speak to the limitations from personal experience, the limitations of saying, I have a disease, because then you are the victim of this thing outside yourself, as opposed to, this isn't me, but it's a part of me, and it's a distortion of me. And it came from my sensitivity, and it came from the pain that I endured in my life. And now I can take my sensitivity, and I can take my past, and like I said, I can renegotiate my relationship with that, so that what was accursed becomes a gift. And then all the steps and all of the basically idea to transmute this suffering into being a positive force for good in the world and supporting other people is beautiful. But like anything, and you know this better than anyone, any organized human endeavor can turn into dogma and doctrine, and where it wants to provide freedom can provide new limitations if we don't hold these words with a bit of lightness and flexibility.
I appreciate you bringing that up, because I have had a lot of experience in the 12-step recovery rooms, And to say I'm an alcoholic every day in meetings, I am an alcoholic for years, that wasn't healthy for me anymore. I think it kind of made me sick spiritually. And
Yeah,
it became a part of my identity. And it was like the false self, because that's not who I really am. That was a part of me, but that's not who I am. I
very
am an
good.
alcoholic. So when I now, like, if I, or I am an addict, if I go to the rooms, I say I'm a grateful member of blah, blah, blah.
Yeah,
And that's more healthier for me. Gratitude's a healthy, I would say one of the highest forms of thought is gratitude,
100%.
and so it's more healthier for me. And then I always say in religion, they call it the devil. In spirituality, you might hear it as the ego. Or in the 12-step rooms, they call it the disease. The disease is doing push-ups in the parking lot. It's ready to get me. And it's like that voice, it's the disease. And it's like, it moves us. It removes me from really looking at myself, and
Well, unless you kind of put a hyphen in the middle of the word and say it's the dis-ease.
yeah, yeah.
Whose dis-ease? My dis-ease. There's a lack of ease. It's not a disorder. There's disorder. There's a lack of order in there. Things got turned topsy-turvy.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think that's very wise. But as long as it's helping people, I'm not going to tell people they shouldn't use certain language. It's just a question of being aware of the limitations. And yeah, I mean, look, I see people in the healing world all the time where, there's a trauma vortex you can get into. There's also a healing vortex where now you're identified. I'm a traumatized person.
Yeah.
I see it around my dad's work sometimes. People are so grateful to be seen and have their pain heard. But, what I have my eye on is now that you know that you were traumatized and you're carrying some wounds, are those wounds who you are? And who would you be if you didn't identify with those wounds? Don't ignore them. But we always want an identity. We always want to identify with something, to make ourselves the same as something, to define ourselves some way. And whatever we've practiced, our brains are creatures of habit. We are creatures of habit. So whatever we feed, that's what will grow. So it's always a matter of, to everything there is a season, turn, like a time to face your disease and a time to let your disease go, a time to acknowledge your trauma and a time to, I don't know, hopefully release it.
I was laughing the other day because I was listening to a talk you were giving, and you brought up someone saying how your father's a mindfulness, like yogi or whatever, or master at mindfulness, and you're not. It made me laugh.
Did I say that? Did I tell that story in a talk?
Yeah, you did. You did, and made me laugh.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, even my dad would say that he doesn't practice it as much as he preaches it, but he was all too ready to agree with the person in that moment that his son is not very mindful. And I gave him a piece of my mind, about that. I said, you have no idea how much mindfulness it takes me to stand up here with you.
I love that. Speaking of that, what was it like growing up as Daniel Maté? Your father's always been some kind of figure in society, in your environment, in your community, and now he's known worldwide. Well, both of you are now, but that's awesome.
Yeah. Well, it was complicated. That's the best word for it. It was complicated. My parents are both amazing people, just really remarkable personalities, and they have big hearts and deep souls, and both want to make a big difference in the world. And they both had shit they were not even close to working through at the time when they had me and my brother and my sister. So they didn't know how to create a family environment, a home that had any kind of emotional stability. And they behaved in ways that are at the very least self-absorbed. I could use other words, but that covers it. Their relationship was either bright and sunny or dark and stormy, and there was no in between, or kind of cold and distant. But we never knew what we were going to get from moment to moment, meal to meal, day to day. My dad was a rageaholic. Just that's how he only had sixth gear, just anger, like screaming, yelling. He only hit me once, but he's told that story many times. Sometimes I'm scrolling through my Instagram feed and there's a reel of my dad talking about when he hit his 3-year-old son across the face for not singing happy birthday to him. I'm like, oh shit, that's me. Ugh, I've told him, don't tell that story anymore. That's my story. And I had tons of fun, great times with them. I mean, my dad and I in particular both share a love for words. So start telling stories and playing games and listening to music and all kinds of stuff was great. But even that was complicated because my dad could relate to me better when I was smart and clever than when I was just an emotional, vulnerable kid. So I grew up really fast and I developed a big old brain. And this is another aspect of the myth of normal, actually. It's not just that trauma leads to problematic afflictions like addiction or illness. It also leads to like winning personalities. It leads to sometimes our favorite, or the things that get us the most results in life bear the scars of our pain, and we don't know it. So my cleverness, for example, nothing wrong with cleverness, but my cleverness cut its teeth on trying to survive a very unpredictable environment where I had to be smarter than my parents. And I became smarter than my parents. I was more clever. I was quicker. I could out argue them on anything. All they had was brute force and their authority. But I knew, and they knew on some level, that it was illegitimate. So I had the upper hand morally. But that's way too much work for a kid. But then I didn't know how to switch that off when I got into the world. And that's exhausting, and I would get depressed as a result. I developed a kind of bipolar tendency, So, look, it made me who I am today. I'm very privileged in many ways. I grew up most of my life in a very leafy Vancouver neighborhood, and never wanting for anything materially. But I was wanting for something predictable, stable. I remember when I would go over to friends' houses, just walking in, my entire nervous system would exhale because it was just a different feeling. So it was intense, and I learned that love equals intensity, which makes intimacy dangerous because the intensity can shift from pleasure to pain very quickly. So as you can imagine, that's affected my personal life and all kinds of stuff. But I got to be creative. I played piano my whole life. It was a real mixed bag.
That's awesome.
It set me up for a life of an adult life that's had a lot of mental anguish in it and some physical difficulties from time to time. Nothing chronic. But it also set me up for a life of self-inquiry. And I can't not credit my parents for that, but I also take some credit myself for that. I mean, I was born with a kind of really strong drive to be myself at all costs. And as we write about in the book, children are torn between two often competing needs. They shouldn't be competing in a perfect world. Attachment, on the one hand, being connected with your caregivers, which is necessary for life. That's for survival, right? But also authenticity, which just means being yourself, knowing how you feel, being able to express it, having access to the full repertoire of emotions. And I needed attachment desperately, but I think more than many kids, I came with a fire in my belly of, fuck you, I won't do what you tell me, if it goes against, and I've been raging against the machine since way before that band formed. Because I did see my parents as mechanical, So it was all of those things. And nothing about my childhood will ever change. That's the thing. It happened the way it happened. But every passing year that goes by, my relationship to it changes, and I see it differently. So when I'm telling you this story now, I have no emotional charge around any of that stuff I just said. If you'd interviewed me a year ago, would have been much more of a undercurrent of bitterness or sadness in the story. So that's also instructive, I think, that, what happened is not the trauma. Our relationship to what happened is the trauma, and what it did to us inside, and how in relationship are we with those wounds.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up, because you start off with the book with the big T and the little t traumas. Maybe you can clarify and give a better example, broaden our lens on that, because a lot of people think, oh, I don't have trauma. I came from a good family, or I wasn't raped, I wasn't molested, and I wasn't beat by as a kid. But I think trauma is a misunderstood word as well.
It is. I mean, part of it is it sounds heavy. You can excuse people for thinking that it means big, blunt force trauma to the head is not a subtle thing. It just means wound in Greek, ancient Greek, I think. I should say that what I just said about trauma not being what happened to you, but what happened inside of you as a result of what happens to you, that's actually true whether we're talking about big T or small t trauma. So when someone is raped, it's not actually the rape itself. I mean, there will be physical scars and bad memories, but it's the inner disconnect that happens and that persists over time. And the decisions we make about ourselves and the parts of ourselves we get cut off from. And sometimes when there are assaults, there was a trauma before the trauma, which is that the child didn't have anyone to talk to about it. So that's the primary trauma, which means they don't trust, they can't speak, they don't have a voice. Well, that's a sign that something got disconnected before the big T trauma happened. So big T would be the adverse childhood experiences you're talking about, which include rancorous divorces, having an addicted parent, mentally ill parent, witnessing something horrific, growing up in a war zone. And those can happen to us in our adulthood too. PTSD among soldiers is common. Now, there may be some correlation between that and previous trauma. I don't know. I don't know who gets PTSD and who doesn't. But the small t traumas would be, I guess the easiest way to break down the difference would be that big T traumas are bad things that shouldn't have happened that happened. Small t traumas come from good things that should have happened that didn't happen. So something got starved or something had to be overstretched to compensate. And that's where the wound comes from. So what do children need? They need calm, consistent attention. Well, if your parents were frenetic, running around, workaholic, or couldn't ever chill out, you didn't get that. That's going to leave a wound, and you have to cope with that somehow. Children need unconditional, positive regard. They need to know that their worth is not contingent on good behavior. Behavior might be important in terms of being pro-social and considerate of other people, but that doesn't make them more or less lovable. But if they learn that their lovability does rest on how they behave, that's going to create a traumatic wound inside the self, because now I don't value who I am. I have to constantly perform and be a perfectionist or be a people pleaser or whatever it is. If I learn that I can't say no, or bad things will happen, or if I learn that I have to caretake a sick or particularly an addicted or mentally ill parent, well, that totally goes against what I was born to need, which is to be taken care of myself by the parent. It's a total perversion of what nature intends. That's going to leave a wound. So I like the term emotional injuries or cognitive emotional injuries if people find trauma too heavy, because also when you're speaking, you can't tell the difference between a capital T and a small t. And I do think there's a danger of overusing the word and turning it into a buzzword and just, and if everything is trauma, then nothing is trauma. We actually my dad interviewed a celebrity, I won't say who, but who I remember he was interviewing him once, doing a Zoom call with him, and my dad was expanding his definition of trauma, Now, what this person had been through was horrific abuse at the hands of one of his parents. And I noticed he started to dissociate as my dad was talking. He was tuning out. And I was like watching the screen. I'm like, Dad, shh, slow down. This guy. And the guy finally said, I can't relate to what you're saying, because if everything's trauma, then what did I go through? And, that's when we realized that we had to make the small t, big T distinction in the book very, very clear. But if the word trauma is too heavy for people, then say, I got wounded in childhood. I'm carrying some marks, or some things were missing and it left a scar, or it left a residue, or there are consequences. I mean, however you want to put it. Whatever empowers you, just like the word disease. I think trauma can be held too literally and become a religion of its own. And I don't think that's useful. But if you know what you mean by it, it's important to realize that you could have had a quote unquote good childhood, especially compared to a lot of people. I mean, most people that I know are living in the top 1% of the top 1% of favorable conditions, materially speaking, on the planet today. In the wealthiest society that human beings have ever known. But that doesn't mean we got out of childhood scot-free. And it doesn't mean that the person we became is all that we are. So if you're interested in truly being all you can be, and if you find that there are limitations to that, predictable, repetitive, chronic limitations or health problems, your body actually expressing it, that's a sign that inside your so-called good childhood, there were experiences that you've been disconnected from. And that's another sign of trauma. We go numb, or we kind of intellectualize. It's like, yeah, that happened. My dad would yell, or, my mom would come home drunk, but I don't remember being upset about it. Well, there's a reason you don't remember, because you blocked it out. It's too painful. So it's just worth being curious, because ultimately it'll help you have a more fulfilled whole life as a grown-up. And until we face the past as it was, we're kind of stuck inside it, and we sort of are doomed to relive it over and over again.
Thank you. Yeah, one of the things that really got me was really looking at myself, and as a young boy, taking me back to the past and looking how it affected my brain development, but really looking at what created that false narrative, or that negative belief system in the head, that voice in the head. I was so attached to it. I never had space or awareness to really just look at that in a healthy lens, because I believed that's who I really was. And growing up as a little kid, Mexican kid from LA, anytime I would watch a big movie and I see my kind, in Hollywood, the only time I would see me is as a rapist, a convict, being arrested, illiterate.
Someone saying essay in a threatening way.
Yeah. And they got the essay part wrong in the Hollywood, because we don't even talk like that in the streets. No, but I believe that.
Are you telling me that Cypress Hill, when they started off, what's the matter, essay? Don't you know I'm loco? Are you telling me that that's not real?
No, it's real. It's real, but we have personalities. I'm just saying. It makes it look like we don't have any personalities. It's just really, it's just the way they portray.
Of course.
And it's like, wow. But I guess I was programmed through my environment too. And I'm not saying that as being a victim, but really understanding, like, wow, I believe that's who I'm supposed to be, this narrative. So I have to change my story. When I had this awakening in 2009, and that's what spirituality for me means, is really taking responsibility for my own thoughts and my own actions. Not so much Jesus take the wheel, but let me learn how to steer the wheel myself and be aware of my surroundings, and
which is all that Jesus taught in the first place.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. You too can do the things I do,
Yeah,
so
it's more like that. It's not Jesus take the wheel. It's like, Jesus, where's the driving manual? And I'll
yeah.
Jesus was a righteous Jew who had a lot of things to say.
Yeah, he was.
And there's a reason. I love everything you just said, and there's a reason that you believed all those things. That narrative, it's because it had survival value. That's the crazy part. This is the part that's so hard to get your head around. hating yourself, feeling guilty all the time, being ashamed, thinking you're no good, it's the best worst option, because the alternative, which kids are not capable of, or at least all but the very few kids, is realizing, oh, I was born into a very dangerous world that cannot provide for me. My parents are incompetent emotionally. They are, I can't rely on the world. So I'm going to have to wait until I get grown up. I'm going to have to hold the fort and get out there in the world. But I got to hold on to myself in the process. You don't have time for that. Ain't nobody got time for that. You got to survive this environment, which means you got to get your mind right. You got to cope. You got to survive. Well, how are you going to stay the course? How are you going to reliably betray yourself to please other people? Well, you better believe you're a piece of shit. So that's the best worst option. It must be up to me, or it must be my fault, because the upside of that is, if it's my fault, then maybe, just maybe, if I'm good enough, I can avoid the worst of what's already happened. But then, of course, living with that is intolerably painful, and that's why we reach out for self-soothing substances and behaviors to make that go away, which of course reinforces the shameful story, and on and on and on, which I'm sure you know much more intimately than I do.
Yeah,
or at least as intimately. I'm having a sober September. I'm not smoking weed right now this September, and it's hard. It's hard. I like having something available that can change my mind, that can change I like escaping from myself.
Yeah.
And, but there was just something about living as a slave to that compulsion. It's like I wanted to taste even the difficulty of not having it there, because there are rewards to that too. So I'm 7 days in. I'm
Congrats.
I'm Daniel. I use weed compulsively, and I've been clean for 7 days, and I'll be clean for another 23 days at least, and then we'll see.
You know, you got me thinking of Cypress Hill, and I could sound exactly like Be Real in any karaoke, any song of Cypress Hill. Be Real, I mastered his voice, and I can sound like Snoop a little bit too.
And I bet if you and I were there, I could do Send Dog very well.
Oh, that's all. We got to do that sometime.
we ain't going on.
Hits from the bong. I love karaoke now.
Oh, my God.
Mental chiropractor.
Yeah.
I think that's interesting. How'd you get that title, and what is a mental chiropractor walking with Daniel look like?
Thank you. Well, I guess it's my side hustle, or maybe the writing with my dad is my side hustle, because I consider myself a musician and composer first. But that I don't make a living at that currently. But it's very important to me. The mental chiropractor thing. Someone gave me that title in Peru, of all places, at an ayahuasca retreat that I was co-leading with the woman I was married to at the time.
Wow.
Who was an apprentice of my father's. It was very complicated, because I apparently can't do anything in a non-complicated way. And he was remarking that he was expecting me to be Gabor Jr., but I wasn't. He's like, you don't work with people like your father does. I said, you're goddamn right. But I said, what is it that I do? I know I'm doing something. I don't know what it is. And what's funny is that's how my dad started out. My dad's not trained as a therapist. He just started following his nose and asking people questions, and he developed a certain modality, a certain skill. Now it's called compassionate inquiry. But I didn't have a name for what I was doing. He said, you're like a mental chiropractor. I was like, bingo. That's exactly what I am. Because I want to get in and get out. I want to make a difference right now. I want to get to the simplest way of looking at the thing. I don't want to deal with your issues. I want to deal with your situation. I fundamentally don't care about your childhood. Not that I don't care. I have compassion. And of course, I understand that your childhood is contributing hugely to the way you see the world now, which is what's got you in the situation you're in that's so stuck or intolerable. But I don't think that telling you any more about your childhood, which you probably already know if you're speaking to me, is going to help you sort out what to do about this situation now. and it can become this reinforcing thing. And so many people who come to me, when I tell them I'm not a therapist, they say, I know, that's why I'm here. So then what is it? Well, it's a mental adjustment. If you think of what a chiropractor does, it's an adjustment to the spine for a very specific purpose, alignment. Why alignment? Because when things are aligned, the thing just works. So when a car has its wheels aligned, that is so it can function and last. I was doing a road trip in California once, and I was driving my father's shitty 1987 Toyota Corolla or something. And I'm driving up towards Shasta, and I noticed that the steering wheel is rattling violently, and I pull over. I don't know what's going on. And I go around and I just sort of casually touch the front wheel, and it scrapes my hand. I'm like, what the hell? Well, it turns out I didn't know this because I'm not a handy guy, but there are metal filaments inside of tires, and it had been completely worn down. How? Because the wheels were totally out of alignment. And so it was kind of tilting to one side, and it was rubbing and whatever. And I had to get the whole thing replaced. And the car was actually, it was just not even worth, once I got to Portland, it wasn't even worth fixing. Well, the human mind is like that, just like the human spine is like that. When something's not aligned, we go really wonky, and we lose touch with our best qualities, and it's a lot more work. We're very inefficient. We get very rigid or inflexible. We get stuck in patterns that we hate. You know, I mean, addiction is a sign of a huge misalignment. Now, I can't like cure someone's addiction in a walk, but I can adjust their relationship to their addiction depending on what's feeling stuck about it. So, but the thing is this, with the spine, a chiropractor knows what the spine is supposed to look like, and they make an adjustment to make it that way, right? The spine, you can't align something with nothing. It has to be aligned with a particular configuration. There's a design to things. So I have to ask myself, well, how is the mind designed? And when someone called me a mental chiropractor, I thought about this, and I realized that there are so many different parts to the mind. There's the thoughts, the emotions, the sensations, the beliefs, the opinions, and then there's the intentions. And I think the most reliable thing that we could align our minds with is our intentions. The intentions we choose, not the unconscious covert intentions, but the things we actually aspire to, and the things we actually positively long for or want. Well, if I know what my intention is, then I can ask, okay, here's my intention over here on the left, and over here on the right is the way I'm looking at the situation. Something's out of whack, because however I'm looking at it, it's not aligned with that intention. It's got something else going on. And the problem is it's hard to see your own point of view. Like you can't see your glasses right now, except maybe in the periphery, right? Because they're on. But what if you didn't even know you had glasses? It's like a virtual reality helmet that's been welded to your shoulders. And our points of view are like that. Until someone points out, hey, you have a point of view. We don't know it's a point of view. We think it's real. So being stuck, in my view, is called in some ways being welded to an inefficient, out of alignment point of view that doesn't match your core intentions, and being so out of whack that you may not even know what your intentions are. So my walks with people, and they're literal walks, I walk with them in person or on the phone. They walk where they are, I walk where I am. Starts with setting an intention, and then taking a look at the situation they're dealing with from the perspective of, well, what's the missing link here? Why is your intention not carrying the day? What's in the way of it? And it's, either an hour and 15 minutes or an hour and 40 minutes. And it's like a one-time thing. I don't say, I'll see you next week. If I have to see you next week, something's off. I haven't done my job. Which is a terrible business model if you think of it. Like but I do have repeat customers sometimes. People come back, but I don't want to see them again about the exact same thing because I don't think we have to.
Any last words, like any advice you can give someone, any helpful advice or practice when they're in that heated moment?
What heated moment?
Like of anger or frustration. And
Mm, I'd have to have a more specific example to give it. I think advice is dangerous
Mm.
when it's generalized, because advice has to be informed by the specifics of the situation. But generally speaking, the more curiosity you can bring to your own experience, it's kind of like stepping outside my disease, that model.
Mm.
Your opinions, your feelings, your points of view, they're not who you are either. They're a part of you. But we get so, it's like the alien on your face, you know? And there are certain kinds of attitudes that can loosen the hold of that. And curiosity is one, compassion is one, insight and understanding about the larger context. And sometimes it takes just getting outside and taking a walk, and sometimes it takes having a conversation with someone else and saying, look, I'm stuck in this point of view, but I can't even see what it is. What can you tell me? And see where it goes. Um, yeah, I'd say never stop being a mystery to yourself.
Mm. Thank you. And how can we find you? Say someone was interested in walking with Daniel.
Just throw up a big D in the sky and I'll be there. No. Walkwithdaniel.com is where you can book a walk with me, or if you want to have a conversation first, a free 15-minute consult. If you want to check out my musical theater work or anything else, danielmaté.com. But walkwithdaniel.com is the mental chiropractic site.
Thank you, Daniel. Thanks for coming on. I really appreciate it.
Absolutely. My pleasure.
Take care.
You too.